Welcome back to the Gum tutorial series. To start, this is going to be a bit of a long video, so please use the chapters to jump around to a specific topic that you're looking for. In this video today, we're going to go and talk about Gum in a bit more detail. There are many shortcuts, dormant properties, and some tricks that you can use. And if you want, you can find detailed documentation on the website. You can go to the general properties. So if we go over here to general properties on the documentation site, it will go into details about what we're going to be talking about today, along with the text section. And we'll talk about some of the things we're going to go over today. So if you're interested in looking it up, go there. First, what I'll do is I'll give you a quick reintroduction to what the Gum tool is. Then we'll cover some of the updates to the Gum tool since the last video. After that, we'll go into the main content of this video, which has four things. We're going to go over a few tips, talk about the variables tab in detail, so the section here. So if you click on an item, an element, the variables tab. After we go over that in detail, we're going to be mainly focusing on the positions section up here, the dimensions, and then some of the children sections down below here on containers, children layout options. After that, we're going to discuss the alignment shortcuts, so the alignment tab here. And finally, I'm going to cover some unique units for standard elements like text, so some of the things that are different and unique to the text element down here. Here's the quick reintroduction of Gum. So the Gum is, if you recall from the first video, it's two main pieces or two parts. The first part of Gum is a what you see is what you get GUI creation editor or tool. And that's what this is right here. That's what I'm displaying on the screen right now. This is a tool that allows you to create a user interface or a overlay or some sort of a UI element that can be put into your program or your game. Now, additionally, there's actually a Gum code runtime that allows you to add your elements to your project. So if you look at the bottom section, if you recall from last time, we've got all these different options. You can output to Monogame, Maui, Roskia, WPF, Sarman Forms. Each one of these has a little bit different syntax, but the idea is that you should be able to install the Gum NuGet package, and then you can generate the code, and you can put this into your project, and then you'll be able to display the same UI elements, and you don't have to write any code realistically. All you'd have to do is use this editor to define what your UI elements should look like. All right, so now that we've talked about the intro of reintroduction of what Gum is, you can go back and watch that previous video if you need more details. Now we're going to jump into some updates that happened. If you go to the GitHub page and you go to releases, you can see that there are, I think, 2 or 3 releases that came since the last time. And I'm not going to go over them in detail, but you can take a look at all the different updates that have happened. There are some further updates coming that are already in source control. If you were to go to the source code yourself, you can actually download this code. You can run the Visual Studio project, the solution. You can open it, and you can build it, and you can make code changes yourself to this tool. If you find there's something you want to add to the functionality of this tool, you can do that. You can add new functionality to this tool, and you can push that up, and you can contribute to this open source project. So the creator of Gum is Vic. I am not the creator of Gum. And he's the one that has been doing all of these different updates. He's pretty fast to respond, and if you have bugs, issues, or suggestions, you can open up an issue here on GitHub with any of the issues that you have, and He is very fast at responding. You can jump on Discord and ask questions there. If you make a code change yourself and you fixed a bug or you've added a new feature that is something that the community would want, you can create a pull request. You could submit your change and be part of this library. All right, next up, let's get into some quick tips. So in the UI, we've got a few different things I want to talk about that even I didn't know about. First are on the side and the top, there's these rulers, and you can hide your tools, you can show your tools. So with this ruler here, you can see if you needed to be able to align something, so let me just do a quick add screen, and I'll just create the screen, and I'll just drop in a container, and then I'll drop in a colored rectangle, and I'll just make this colored rectangle blue or something. Oops, blue. There we go. So what you could do is if you were trying to align multiple, let me do a Control-C copy, Control-V paste to make two instances of this over here. Let's do this one for a different color. Let's make this one red. Sure, why not? Now let's say I wanted to align these two perfectly inside of here. Well, I could zoom in and I could try to get it just right, or I could go into the variable section and I can make sure that I put the X positions just right and all that stuff, right? But another thing you can do if you're trying to line up a lot of elements is you can just click on the ruler. And if you click on the ruler, you actually add a line. And this will allow you to kind of help guide you on aligning things, or at least getting a general sense of things. You can even add it to the top. So we've got one here, we've got one here. Currently, if you want to remove it, you have to click on it, and then you just drag it all the way to the left, and then it will go away. And then this one here, drag it all the way up, and it will go away. So that's the first thing. You can add those little guides on the ruler. Some other tips, you can hover over to the corner. So if I click on this and I hover over the corner, we can see that there are values that are being displayed showing the width and the height of this element. And as I change those values, the width and the height values are being displayed. But not only that, and we'll get into units here in a second, now on this, if we wanted to, in addition to seeing those values, so I can see that there's the width and the height values, right? In addition to that, what I could do is I could change the way the width values work. Instead of it being absolute, I could change it to one of these others. Let's just put some other value here temporarily. If I hover over now, you can see that it says 65 and it says relative to container. So it kind of helps you see what your units are when you're working with the width and the height units. Be careful of the values. Depending upon the unit settings and the values, you could position an element outside the parent like I've done here. So I've made this actually outside the parent element, which is this container right here. So just be careful when you're doing these changes that you're not accidentally pushing something outside of the bounds of the object that you want it to be contained within. Choosing the same value for a variable or option for a unit that matches the default value does not lock the element to that default. What am I talking about? So by default, the X and Y positions are 0. If I just set these back to 0, 0, you'll notice that they didn't change to green. And that's because now, if you look down at the bottom here, the actual X and Y positions are being hard-coded for this instance. It's no longer going to assume the default values. If I want it to retain the defaults, I still have to right-click, make default. Right-click, make default. And if you noticed, once they're default, they're no longer being set down below. You can see a visual representation of the positioning location by selecting an element and looking for the white line. And so what am I saying here again? Again, sounds like a bunch of nonsense, but if we click on these, you see that there's a white line going from top corner to top left corner. it's not going to always stay in those positions. So if I change the units to the center, notice it's now coming from the center of the parent instead of coming from the top left of the parent. So this will help give you a quick visual representation of what are your units for positioning. Whereas when you hover, it gives you a pretty good representation of what are your units for the width, what are your units for the height. All right, let's talk about variables. Under the variable section here, there's a bunch of different sections, but the ones we're going to talk about today are position, dimensions, and then we'll jump into some of the items that are specific to containers and then text. So for position, we've got the X and the Y, which those are pretty obvious, right? How far over, how far down, X and Y position. But we've also got these things called units, X units. And what these do is these change the meaning of what this X is doing. So for instance, right now, it is the number of pixels from the top left of the container object, or from the left side of the container object. Whereas when it's center, it's the number of pixels from this center position. And if it is pixels from the right, it is the number of pixels from the right. And you notice this is another situation where it would put it outside the bounds. And so there are different ways that you could put something back inside bounds by using a negative value or using some of the other values we'll talk about later. So for now, I'll put it back to 50 and just tell it to go ahead and stay right there. So the other X units values here will modify the meaning of what this X value is. So the position X units here, again, there is pixels from left, pixels from center, pixels from right, and then percentage of the parent's width. So if I set this, now it's only going to be 34%, or let's say 90% position-wise of the parent's width. And we'll set it to only 10% of the width. So this means that this is essentially 10 pixels in, because the parent is set to 100 pixels, and therefore this child is set to what's essentially 10 pixels in from that point. The values for the Y units are similar, so we've got pixels from top, pixels from bottom, pixels from the center Y inverted, pixels from bottom, pixels from height, or percentage height, and then pixels from baseline. Now the Y variable is similar to the X, where it's basically just the standard Cartesian coordinate system's value of Y. This indicates the position of the location where the top of this element will be placed. So if I move this around, we can see that this is retaining the percentage of placement of where this is. And the bottom was the pixel position of where it's at. So I'm at pixel position 1. If I get really close here, I'm not really touching it, but it's 0.66% of 100, which is close to 1 pixel. So the items here are mostly the same, but there's a few different ones. We notice that there's the left and the top are basically the same, center and center are basically the same, right and bottom are basically the same. But we've got this other item in here that is used mainly in the back end. And then we've got essentially this last one here, which is pixels from baseline. And this one's a little bit more unique. So let me get rid of this other object, and we will set some of these back to normal values for now, defaults. I'm going to add a text object inside of it. Actually, it can just be next to it. And so what you notice about this is that even though the position of this has a height of, say, 26 pixels, the position of the bottom of the letters is actually right about here. And that's because this is what's called the baseline. There are some text elements that will go below the baseline, like Y, G, P, things like that. And so sometimes what you want is you want your element to align with the bottom of that text element so it looks like it's on the same line. You don't want it to be aligned down here. That would look kind of funky. So that's what this special option is called pixels from baseline. Okay, so now I've set up this scenario and I just wanted to demonstrate it for you. So the pixels from baseline value. We've got the text. I've got my little guide here showing approximately where the bottom of the text is. We can see that my colored rectangle is positioned at 0 on the Y, but it's using the value of pixels from baseline. And because it is a child of the text instance, it knows to use the baseline for that text instance. Now, in addition to that, the baseline position, you can see that it's not the bottom of so if I select this text, you can see it's not the bottom. But one of the things to be cautious of is that if you make this too large, the baseline is now no longer in line with the text. It is instead aligned with the bottom, essentially minus a certain number of pixels. So make sure your text boxes are the appropriate height for the text. And we'll get into some of the ways you can do that when we talk about the dimensional widths and the dimensional heights. Now we need to talk about the origins a little bit. And so the origin is essentially where where the center point or where the XY point should be represented on this. So if I just drag this over here and we change this back to absolute values, put them all back like this. So right now, the XY is considering the top left of this rectangle as the origin position. And so if we were to change these different values, instead of saying left or center or right, those can change where this X is pointing. So instead of the X pointing at the far left, and so it being drawn here, because the X now means the center of the whole object, well then the starting has to be the center minus half the distance. And if it's going to be the right side, then it has to be the position that we've provided, 28 pixels, minus the whole width of the object, 51 pixels. And that's the actual starting position of where to draw the rectangle. So these values here can help you orient your objects inside of their containers. And the same goes for the Y origin, so top, center, and bottom. You can see that the position of where this is pointing at is different in each one. We'll go on to the dimensions for width and height. So width is obviously the point from top left here to the top right here. That's the width, how wide it is. And the height is, of course, top left to bottom left. That is how tall it is. For the width units and the height units, we essentially have the same functionalities. It's just that these are for the widths and these are for the heights. The first is absolute. And what that means is that if I change this to 57, then the number of pixels from the far left starting position to the far right is going to be exactly 57 pixels wide. It's going to be absolutely 57. Whereas the next one here, which is relative to container, essentially what it says is, let's just click it so we can see. If it was 0, and we'll zoom out a bit, what you can see is that it looks like it's essentially the same size as this container, this text image, or text element. But it's just moved over. So we can match them up and we can see that they are indeed the same size. So even though I've got it set to 0 width, it doesn't mean 0. What this means is because I have relative to container, the width of this element will be the same as its container, which is the text instance, and the value in width then changes to mean how many pixels above or below, if it's negative, the container size. So if I set this to -50, it's going to be the same as its parent container, which is this text instance, but it's going to be 50 pixels less. If I said +50, it's now going to be 50 pixels wider. So that's what the relative to container means. Then we have percentage of container. This is the exact percent width of the container. So if it's 100, that is the exact size of the container. If it's 50, that's going to be half. So if I click this, it should end up right about here, right about this E. So let's click on the blue and let's set it to percent. 50% is indeed right about there. Next, we have the ratio to container. It's an easy way to create a relationship between the children sizes, so the sizes of the children elements, and the parent. So this is a container. We can say, go ahead and create a ratio to the container. And what you notice is that it doesn't look like it's doing anything. And the reason why is because this ratio is essentially adding up all of the children that are part of it. Let me get rid of this text by pulling this out. And let's not do text for right now. Get rid of that. And let me make 2 of these. So I've got 2 of these in here. And they both have, let me change the color as well. Let's change this to pink, something different. This first one is set to 1 for the ratio of container. This one is also set to 1. And so what this really means is that this and this are the same ratio for the total size of the container from top left all the way to here. And you can see if I stack them next to each other manually, that we kind of get this representation that shows, yeah, these are essentially 1 plus 1 is 2. So this is 1/2. This is also 1/2. If we wanted to make one of them bigger, so let's say I wanted this one to be 2 times the size of this one, well, I just set this one to 2. And now this is 2 units, whereas this one's only 1 unit. If I want it to be 3 times the size, so this one is 3 units, where this one is 1 unit of a total of 4 units. And so you can kind of see where that ratio comes in. To make things a little bit easier, what I'm going to do is jump ahead for 1 second to the container, and I'm going to change this so that it does children layout stacking, left to right stacking. And then I will go back here and go back to my instance and make sure that we don't have any values added for the Y. Oops, for the X I meant. There we go. There's the other one set to 0 as well. 0, 0. Okay, so now what's happening is that because I set the container's children layout to left to right stack, let's add another one. I'll take note of these blue ones, I guess, and we'll paste it and put it in here. Then I'll copy one of the pink ones, paste that. And you'll notice that as I keep stacking it, the size of the objects keep shrinking, but the ratio is remaining the same between them. So we've got 3, and this one's also 3. This is a size of 1, and this is a size of 1. So if we add 3 and 3, we get 6, and 1 and 1. So we have a total of 8 units if we were to divide this evenly up. And this one has 3 units, this has 1 unit, this has 3 units, this has 1 unit. And so it's kind of a nice way with using these ratio of container that you can define these different values that are all relative to each other. Okay, I've played around with that for a bit. Let's jump on to the next one. Relative to children. This can allow you to essentially auto-grow the width based off of the relationship between, or based off of the children. So this one itself we wouldn't want to touch because this is a child. And we'll come back here and we will set this to the parent equal to, the width should be relative to children. We don't want to add any extra pixels. And then each one of these, we need to now essentially set its width, because now we're kind of in the situation where the children are trying to rely on their container parent, and the parent is trying to rely on the container's children. So what we're going to do for these children is we're going to set an absolute value of, let's say, 25, and we'll do 30. Again, absolute value of, let's say, 40, and this one we'll set to an absolute value of 50. And you notice that the container now is the exact width of these items added in now. We've got 25, 30, 40, and 70, and then we've got the container here. So it's the added up values of all of those children, 145 pixels total. So let's see if it makes sense. 50, 90, 120, 145. Yep. And so if we were to shrink this 51 down to 25, notice that the container itself also shrunk. So this is a nice way that you can make sure that those values are dependent upon the combined size of the children. So it's relative to the children's widths combined. Now, if you were to take and turn off the children layout option, and we were to go ahead and try to move one of these around, what you'll notice is that now it's not really the width necessarily that's being applied for this value. It's really the item that is the furthest to the right. So it's kind of a combination of the width and the X position that is now manipulating the container's width. So hopefully you can see some reasons why you'd want to be able to have your object manipulate the size of the parent so that your parent can grow as necessary for the number of children that are there. And then the last is so this is a ratio that is dependent upon the width. And so what I'll do is I will go here and we will set this to ratio of height. So right now the height is 150. And we're setting it to a 0% of that. Let's set it to exactly 100%. So now, because this is 150, this will be 150. If we wanted the ratio to be double, we could set this to 200%. And now it would be 200%, which is double. So now we've got 300 pixels wide because it's 200% height versus 150. So that's what this percentage of height button does. Next, there is this absolute modified by font scale. And we're going to kind of skip this one for now because it's dependent upon factors that really aren't at play yet. Rather than going into detail about the height, which is basically the same thing as the width values or the units, instead I'm just going to read them to you and let you know that the functionality is the same except for it's going top to bottom versus left to right. So we've got the absolute, relative to container, percent of container, ratio of container, the relative to children, that percentage, this time of the width, so it will change the height depending upon the percentage you're using of the width value, and then the absolute modified by font scale that again for now you can just ignore. Going back to the children, so if we go to this container instance here, we have these different layout options, and the default is what's called regular, but it's essentially free form. It's wherever you place these objects, that's where they will be. There's not going to be something that's going to change their layout. Whereas if we do stacking top to bottom, and I was to go through and adjust all of these so that their X position or their Y positions, their height is all 0. And now we can see when we go back to the container that they're all stacked on top of each other. It just looks a little bit funky because they don't have them stacked directly on top of each other. Positions within the parent are stacked vertically, but not horizontally in this case. Whereas here, if we do left to right stacking, that's the one I was showing you before, and then we change all of these again so that their X positions are all 0 instead of being modified. We can now see that they are actually on top of each other and that they are stacked. And that will actually make the other stacking look a little bit better too. Hey, look, a bar chart. You can also do auto grid. So when you do this, it will do left to right and then down and then down. So instead of doing 4, let's just do 2, a 2 by 2 grid. So now it's auto align these out. So we've got 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we can do that for certain by picking the first one here, and we'll do blue. The next one, see right there, pink is selected, and the third element, blue, is selected, and the fourth element, pink, is selected. Whereas now if we go back to the parent container and we change this to auto grid vertical, it will go down first and then over. So the first element, again, is up here. The second one is down. Third element is up here on the top again, and the fourth is down here. Now, if I go back to the container, it's important to pay attention to the auto grid horizontal cells and the vertical cells. That's essentially how many, you can think about this as how many columns. So the auto grid horizontal cells, this is the number of columns essentially, and here's essentially the number of rows. So maximum will be, let's say, 8. And you notice that the space between them gets smaller because it's taking into account the height of this parent object. So if we just said 2, well, it's going to divide this parent up into 2 halves and place the first element here, the second element here. And as we shrink this, we can see how that works. Now we're going to get into alignment. Alignment is basically a set of shortcuts. So let's go over there and take a look at that. We've got the anchor section and the dock section. And what the anchor is doing essentially is modifying the units and the XY values of the position. Now that we've got these values, if I pick one of these, let's say this one here, and I change the alignment to the top left of the parent, it moves it automatically up to the top left. So it essentially sets, again, the X, Y, X units and Y units. You notice that these change to absolute pixels from left and pixels from top. Whereas if we had had these set to some other values, whatever they may be, and I had 10 here and 10 here, the second I go and I select the alignment top left, we can see that it went back to 0, 0, and pixels from left and pixels from top. So it's just shortcuts. That's all it really is. This shortcut, we'll put it in the middle. Zoom in a bit here so you can see easier. This shortcut will go to the top right, just as the pictures are demonstrating. And so these can help you align elements. Now, in addition to alignment, there's also the ability to dock. Now, dock is modifying the positions also, but it is additionally modifying the widths. So we're going to get not just the position values, but we're going to be getting some of the dimensional values being modified by the docking. So if I do this top one, let's first take a look. We've got absolute selected for both. We've got some hard-coded values for the width and the height. And then we've got the first two selected for units. Now if I select this top one to dock it to the top, essentially we can see that it's moved the X position to the top, the Y position to the top, but the width is now going to be relative probably to the container. So let's go take a look at that. Let's go see what it looks like. So this is actually set pixels from center, and it centered itself. This is pixels from top. And down on the width, we're saying the width should be relative to the container. So its width should be the same width as the container. And then we've got the height didn't change. So it did not modify our height at all. So if we were to make this larger, and I was to press it again, it's not modifying anything because it does not modify the height value. It's only modifying the width value and then the positional arguments. So if we shrink it down a little bit, go this way, put it down here, we should see that this is going to now change back to the other values. So I've messed with these values, and now we're going to see, oh, the X origin changed on it also. But yeah, we've changed these values. Now we're going to click that button. Goes back to the top. We can see that the X changed to 0. The X unit's position is now pixels from center. The origin is also changed to center. And then we've got the width changing and the Y units and the Y value changing. So all of those values changed, but the height does not get modified by this shortcut or combination button. There's also dock left, which looks kind of funky. It almost looks like we did the center one, but that's only because we had previously had it already at the existing width. And similar to this one, where dock to top doesn't modify the height. If I undo that, we can press this, and we'll see that the dock to left doesn't modify the width. So this was set to relative to container because of the other value. If we set this to 0 absolute, I guess let's set it to 30 or 20 absolute, and we move it. Just move it around now. So I can change the width of this, and it doesn't change. So 26, I've moved it away from the spot. It's 59 now. Goes back, it's 59. So just be aware of that when you're using these, they might not modify all of the values, but they are going to be modifying a combination of the values and the units for positions and for dimensions. And you can play around with these different values here just to see what they would do. The last section we're going to cover is the text element. Let's add in a text element. Let's take a look at it. So we can see that, yeah, it has some of the same values, so we're not going to go over those again, position and dimensions. But there's a different section that is specifically for the text element because obviously it deals with characters, letters, numbers, text. So we've got the text. That should be pretty obvious. Whatever you type here, whatever you type there is going to show up inside of your text element. So that should be pretty obvious. We then have horizontal alignment, vertical alignment, max letters to show, text overflow vertical mode, text overflow horizontal mode. Now the horizontal alignment and the vertical alignment should be very similar if you've done any text editing in any text editor. Those values are essentially the same as you normally have. So we've got left adjusted, centered, and right adjusted on the font. So if I do this, let me make this a little bit bigger, we can see that the text is now centered instead of being left adjusted. Same thing with over here. If I do right, everything's going to be aligning on the right side. And depending upon what you're trying to do, different things might have different purposes. Vertical alignment, Same thing as horizontal, but it's going the opposite. It's going up and down. So is it centered? Is it from the top? Is it from the bottom? Max letters to show. So what null means here is essentially infinite. So let's put it down to a simpler set of letters. So we'll just say hello max letters. So by default, it's showing all of them. But if we were to change this to just 10, it's only going to show the first 10 letters. If we do 11, and so you could think about this as a way to do some sort of a feature in a game where it's only displaying one letter at a time, and you don't have to actually do any modification to the text. You can just, through each second, half second, whatever game time you want, you could be changing this parameter, this value, to slowly increase it over time so that your message gets typed out almost like it's being printed to the screen or read to you, which is a very common thing that happens in role-playing games and games that have dialogue boxes, kind of like a slow mode for that. Okay, and the next is text overflow. So let me put this back to nothing, which is essentially setting it to null, which is essentially saying there is no limit to the number of characters that can be displayed. Let me type up a longer message here. Hello, thank you for watching this video. Let's see what happens when we change the last 2 units. So we've got vertical overflow vertical mode, or text overflow vertical mode, and text overflow horizontal mode. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom out a little bit and get rid of the colored rectangle that's in our way. And just so this isn't in our way, I'm going to make the parent larger so it's not in our way. And what we can see on the text is that if I change this bottom one, it's got 2 options. When I go past the end of this text horizontal, so left and right, this says, oh, go ahead and truncate it. But we notice that it's not truncating. Here's the size of this element, and nothing is being truncated. Second one here, ellipsis letter, same thing. It doesn't seem to do anything. And the reason why is because on our first option for text overflow vertical, we have selected the default of spill. And so the text just flows out the bottom. It doesn't go out to the right side, but it flows out the bottom. The second that we change this into start truncating the number of lines that are outside this, so let me do something like this. If I truncate this now, we can see that those lines that are outside the container, or not the container, but the text instance itself, those lines are now not being drawn. But there can be situations where maybe part of a letter, like you don't want it to just truncate everything. You want it to just show you ... And so maybe you want it to show part of a word. Instead of truncating the whole thing, show the next part that's coming. So hopefully those will give you different ways that you can draw your text on the screen, show maximum number of characters, changing these values, etc. There's one last bit about text I want to sneak into this video. Let's add a text component. Let's add a really long string. And then we notice that the text is outside the bounds of this text instance. It's flowing down there. But maybe we want this text area to fulfill the entire size of the text. We want this to grow. Well, each one of these letters essentially can be thought of as a child. And so what you can do is you can change the height units on this text instance to relative to children, remove the height value, And what you'll notice is that now, if I grow or shrink the width here, we can see that the height is automatically changing based off of how much text is flowing. So if it flows down to the next line, it will increase that the height to match it. And if I shrink it down the width smaller, it will force the height to be longer. And this can be great because you can do things like you can add in a container above it. So I'll put this text instance inside. And right now the container is small. It's not taking up the size, but I can tell the container also to be the width of the width of the children relative to the children with no additional pixels. And then we can say the height also relative to children, no additional pixels. And so now, whenever the size of this text box changes, the size of the container is changing along with it. And that can help if you have other elements that you want to place inside there, like maybe a colored rectangle that we want to put blue. We want that to be in the background. So I'm going to press Alt up arrow to move it up in the tree. Now it's behind. But now I want it to be, using the alignment tools, I want it to be docked like that. So now, if we go back to the text instance and I change the size of this, not only is the text instance influencing the container's size, but because the colored rectangle is dependent upon the parent, it is also changing. And so we get this this great linked behavior between the parents and the children. So I just want to throw that last little tidbit in there. In closing and in summary, I just want to say that the Gum tool has many different variables. I've only covered a few of them, many different units and different shortcuts. So take a look out here under the documentation, the Gum elements, and we can see the general properties where I covered most of these. We've got other ones that are specific to the different types of elements, like the text that talks about those values that we talked about, the overflow mode. Hopefully some of this helps you and gives you a bit of comfort level with using the tool. But what hopefully you'll see is that by using an editor like this, where you can just click, drag, and set some values, you can define a very complex UI without writing much code, and it allows for easier changing in the future. You don't have to manually place all of your UI elements on the screen. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you want more, and add any suggestions to the chat for future videos.